Well, we spent quite a bit of time talking about New England and the English colonists' interaction with the environment there and with the indigenous people. And then we spent quite a bit of time again sort of doing a brief survey of the history of agriculture and the world and the development of capitalism, all kind of like, spinning off of our discussion about the New England colonists and the Indians. Well, now we're going to look at the southern colonies, which, if we had been going strictly chronologically, we would have looked at first because they were established before the New England colonies were. But we're going to rectify that now, and very briefly, we're going to take a broad look at the history, at the environmental history of the South. Now, first, let's take a look at this map of some of the native tribes of the American Southeast. As you can see, there were quite a few of them when Europeans first arrived. Now, we're going to be talking about the establishment of the Virginia colony and the colony, later the city of Jamestown in 1607. Again, if we were going chronologically, really the beginning of the story of English attempts to colonize North America started a little more than 20 years before this, back in the 1580s, with Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. But I'm assuming that you know that story, and you know that one didn't work out so well. So this was the first successful English colony, 1607. 13 years before the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. Now, the English had various reasons for wanting to establish colonies in North America, one of which was that they would have liked to have found some gold and silver like the Spanish had. And they didn't really they didn't have much success at that along the Atlantic coast of North America. What they did find was what came to be known as brown gold, tobacco, which of course is brown after it's been harvested and cured. Now, tobacco is not indigenous to the Eastern Hemisphere. It's something that native peoples cultivated and smoked. They used for ceremonial purposes primarily, and it had made its way to England even before the 1580s. There had been, back in 1577, there had been an article written about the proposed health benefits of tobacco. You see that the Spanish and Portuguese, who had at this point been interacting with Native Americans for over a century, they had encountered tobacco long before the English, and many of them had picked up the smoking habit. So it wasn't an entirely new thing, but it wasn't very common at all in England. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh brought back some of the colonists from Roanoke to England in 1587, and they brought with them tobacco that they had grown there. So that fact that now tobacco is available from an English colony makes it all of a sudden more accessible to the English public. And it's kind of, even though people had known about it before, it sort of became a craze when Raleigh brought it back and introduced it, and the colonists that came with him demonstrated how to smoke it. He even got Queen Elizabeth to try it. However, by 1604, the successor to Queen Elizabeth, King James I, he didn't like this whole tobacco smoking business. In fact, he wrote a treatise about tobacco, against the use of tobacco. And he called it, quote, "a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black and stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless." Oh, in other words, it's like the smoke of hell. So he raised taxes pretty high on the import of it, and really came down against it. Now, the problem was a lot of English people had tried it, and oddly enough, if you try it for a while, you don't want to stop doing it. And so it continued to be very popular. When Jamestown was established, therefore, it was quickly established that the main cash crop, the main thing that they were going to be able to produce there, was going to be tobacco, with John Rolfe, the guy who married Pocahontas, in 1609, becoming the first of the settlers to grow tobacco on a commercial scale. Then, by 5 years later, 1614, they had started shipping tobacco to England from Jamestown. Well, tobacco is going to be not just the big crop of Jamestown, but later of the colony of Virginia and the later colonies that are established in Maryland and the northern part of the Carolina colony. And it's going to be very, very lucrative. Now, if you want to expand your agricultural base, if you want to produce more, you need more land. And this, of course, led pretty quickly to tensions between the English and the local Native Americans, the Powhatan or Powhatan tribe, who had allowed the English to settle in this marshy area that the Indians didn't really want, which is where they built Jamestown. But then more English started coming, and more and more and more. And the more of them that came, this is similar to the story in New England, the more of them that came, the more aggressive they were, the more entitled they felt, the more pushy and rude they were. Now, the leader of the Powhatan Confederacy, usually referred to by the English just as Chief Powhatan, he had sort of entered into negotiations after some tension with the English because he wanted trade with them, particularly some of the things they had like guns that would give him more leverage among the other tribes. But after he died, his younger brother, Opechancanough, wound up being the principal leader of the Powhatan Confederacy. And there's a drawing of him on the left, and there he is on the right from the movie about 2005 or so called The New World, being played by the great Cherokee actor Wes Studi. Opechancanough felt like it had been a big mistake to allow these English to come in here, and that it needed to be nipped in the bud. Therefore, he organized a massive attack on the English colonists in Virginia in 1622. This was referred to at the time and for centuries thereafter by historians as the Powhatan Uprising. But the Powhatan War is a more appropriate word for it, because an uprising implies a subjugated people, a people rising up against their rightful rulers, and that's certainly not how these Indians looked at it. They looked at it more as a matter of trying to protect their own lands and their own sovereignty. Well, this was a very bloody war. Hundreds of colonists were killed, but eventually the colonists rallied and defeated Opechancanough, which wound up breaking the power of the Powhatan Confederacy in the Tidewater region, so that after that it was the English who were the main power in the area. Now, what is that going to mean for the native people? This map tells that story. On the left, you can see the locations of all the Native American villages in the Tidewater region. There were about 15,000 Native Americans living there in 1607 when the English first arrived. By a little over 60 years later, it had gone from 15,000 to 2,000. And the villages, as you can see, there were far fewer of them, and they were pretty scattered. This was as a result of disease and of the warfare that the English had engaged with the native peoples. So, Native Americans are, by the end of the 1600s, kind of just pushed out of this area. And as that happens, the environment changes significantly, including the fact that the colonists brought a lot of new things with them. For example, the earthworm. The earthworm, which was not native to the eastern part of North America. I think maybe there were earthworms out on toward the west coast, but east of the Mississippi there were none. So that's hard to imagine. What happened, remember, the Virginians, the colonists, started sending their tobacco to England to sell it. So they would have a ship, and they would load that ship up with tobacco, send it across the ocean, sell the tobacco. And then that ship would come back, but it's empty. And an empty ship is a lot harder to navigate. It needs weight. So they have what they call ballast. So when that ship got to England and unloaded all that tobacco, what they would do is they would fill it back up with dirt and rocks from England, sail it back across the ocean to Jamestown, take all the dirt and throw it out, just, kind of toss it out, and then, there's room to put more tobacco in there. So that dirt that got tossed out, good English dirt, was full of good English worms. And over the decades, over the next century or so, those earthworms proliferated and spread all through the eastern part of the United States and caused some really big changes. Now, imagine forests without worms in the soil. Before the advent of the earthworms, forest floors were drier because the dead leaves stayed there longer before they decayed. They weren't being consumed by the worms. So that's one huge change right there. The forest floors become more moist than they had previously been. Another introduction, the honeybee. There were bees. There were some bees. There were bumblebees in North America, but there were no honeybees. And that's hard to imagine too, isn't it? So the honeybees were brought over in 1638 by English colonists who brought hives because they wanted honey, right? And so they would have, they imported beehives and started raising bees. And you know how that works, that some of these bees would get loose and wander off and establish new colonies and new hives, and then they began to spread through the countryside. The Cherokee word for honeybee translates into English flies, because the Cherokees would hear the buzzing. They'd hear this peculiar buzzing, and they would know that there were English colonists close by. Also, mosquitoes. I think there were some varieties of mosquitoes in North America, but there were new species brought over by the English, particularly the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, the Egyptian mosquito from Africa. How did they get there? On slave ships. When African slaves were crammed into the holds of these slave ships that were just like, stacked on top of one another for however long it took, 2 or 3 months to cross the ocean. And they would be lying there, unable to go to the bathroom, except for the 1 hour a day they were allowed up on the deck. And it got really nasty and unhealthy. And the sailors would come down with just buckets of water and just throw the water over them. That was the best washing they got. And that water collected in the hold, and it got stinky. And, these individuals, these human beings being transported, had some of them mosquitoes on them. And they multiplied like crazy, and they just came swarming out of these slave ships. and just went all through the marshier areas of the countryside in North America and spread a lot of disease. Well, these are some major changes for the American Indians, right? Their numbers have been greatly depleted. Their environment in which they live has been changed with these obvious new creatures that are being brought over, like, domestic animals, cows and pigs, but also things that you wouldn't think about, like worms and mosquitoes and so forth. Massive changes, but the biggest change was being introduced, as we discussed earlier, about what happens when that capitalist world system is in action, and when that comes into contact, particularly with subsistence people, they get subsumed, right? So once the native people are subsumed into that trade network, and they start really becoming addicted, you might say, to some of those luxuries that soon came to seem like necessities, and then they became tied into that whole trade network. That led to major changes. And here's an observation from a Virginia colonist named Robert Beverly. About 100 years after the establishment of Jamestown in 1705, he wrote The History and Present State of Virginia, and he had this to say about the Native Americans. Thus I have given a succinct account of the Indians. Happy, I think, in their simple state of nature and in their enjoyment of plenty without the curse of labor. So this is that typical European misconception that Indians were lazy because they weren't constantly working to create excess. They have on several accounts reason to lament the arrival of the Europeans, by whose means they seem to have lost their felicity or happiness, as well as their innocence. The English have taken away a great part of their country, and consequently made everything less plenty amongst them. They have introduced drunkenness and luxury amongst them, which have multiplied their wants and put them upon desiring 1,000 things they never dreamt of before. So it's kind of really, on many levels, an existential change to Native culture and to Native American individuals. Also, guess what? Labor's needed to grow this tobacco and other things that wind up being grown in the southern colonies. And eventually it is slaves that are doing that labor, and life wasn't that great for them either. Actually, I should back up a moment. There were, in fact, in the 1600s in Virginia, there were 3 types of labor being used on these tobacco plantations. 3 types of labor, which essentially were all forced labor to one degree or another. First, there was the use of indentured servants, and those were poor white people from England, many of whom had fallen into debt, some of whom had been sentenced into indenture because of petty crimes, or in some cases some Irish people that were subjugated by the English. But for the most part, people who wanted either to consolidate their debts, or more likely wanted to make it to the New World, because it had been sort of advertised as a place where you can make your way, where you can rise up the social ladder and get your own land, but you have to get there, and it was expensive. So a lot of people sold themselves into temporary servitude, indentured themselves. They signed a contract for usually at least 5 years. The average was more like 7 years, sometimes longer. And during that time, your labor belonged to the person that bought it in that contract, and you had to do whatever they told you. And usually you were not treated that well. But once you reached the end of the contract, then you were free. Your labor belonged to you again, and you could go out and get land At least that was the promise. Now, one of the problems was that early on, in the early to mid 1600s, most of these poor white people who came over as indentured servants did not live to see the end of their 7-year contracts. So that was one thing. Indentured servants. African slaves were first imported to Jamestown in the year 1619. In the beginning, the English had no previous experience with the slave trade, which the Spanish and Portuguese had been in for a couple of hundred years at this point. So they weren't entirely sure how it worked. Some people would buy these African slaves, but treat them like indentured servants and set them free after a certain period of time, which led to the growth of a class of free blacks in the Virginia colony. So you've got poor white people that are indentured servants. You have African slaves, and a lot of times these free blacks who were freed, and then their children, they might wind up becoming indentured servants as well. And then the third type was American Indians, who, beginning with the Pequot War up in New England in 1636, the English policy began to be that it is okay to enslave captives that you take in wars against Indians. And so then this was expanded on up in New England in King Philip's War in the mid-1770s. A lot of these Native Americans were shipped off to the Caribbean, to the English colonies there, like in Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Barbados. And some of them were sent down to work on these tobacco plantations. In fact, over the course of the 1600s, especially in the late 1600s, there was an Indian slave trade that developed in the South, where the English were offering to buy captive Indians that were captured by Indians from other tribes. And this became a really big commercial enterprise. So you had a large number of American Indians. In fact, in Charleston, South Carolina, around 1700, there were more American Indian slaves than African slaves. So, 3 types of people doing the labor throughout the 1600s. None of them having a very good time of it, really. Life was exceedingly difficult for all these groups. But there are going to be some gradual changes in the late 1600s that will result eventually in Africans bearing the load of the forced servitude and forced labor in the southern colonies. At the same time King Philip's War was taking place in New England, down in Virginia there were other issues arising. Now, we're talking about the 1670s, mid-1670s. So by that point, the Jamestown colony, which had grown into the larger Virginia colony, was almost 70 years old. From the beginning, a lot of the labor, most of the labor, was done by indentured servants, right? People from England who had signed those contracts with the understanding that they would come over and do the work, and that when their contracts expired, they would then have their freedom and have access to land. Well, there were a couple problems with that for those indentured servants. First problem was that most of them didn't live to the end of their contract, which again could be anywhere from 5 to 7 or 8 years. So in those early decades of the Virginia colony, between starvation and disease and wars with the Powhatan Indians, a large number of those indentured servants, most of them in fact, just didn't make it. Now, another factor was that those people who had bought their labor, who had signed the other side of that contract, who got their work, knew that they only had them for a limited amount of time. That when those 7 years were up, then that service was up and they'd have to get somebody else So the employers really, in many cases, in trying to maximize the benefits from the indentured servants and trying to get the most out of them as possible, didn't put a whole lot into them. They didn't invest a whole lot in food and medicine, and they worked them sometimes literally to death to squeeze every last drop of benefit from them. So in those early decades of Virginia, the early to the mid 1600s, the number of indentured servants who made it through to their indenture and got to be in a position then to own their own labor, as John Smith had promised, and to look for land, were few and far between. Now, this had started to change by the late 1600s as the colony became more and more settled, as they got the hang of the local agriculture and feeding themselves essentially. And after the end of that Powhatan War in the 1630s, when they sort of leveraged, the English that is, leveraged their power in the region and defeated more and more tribes, then there were fewer Indian wars and fights. So all that put together led to an increasing number of indentured servants actually reaching the end of their contract. And the problem they faced then was that when they went out to claim land, it had all been claimed already in the meantime, during those decades when most indentured servants weren't making it. So the good land had all been claimed really by the more well-to-do people. So there was very little land to be had. What little land was available was the land that no one else wanted, which was usually higher up in the mountains to the west, which is more difficult to produce large crops, particularly of the things that they were growing, and closer to those Indian tribes who were still autonomous. So odds are you're not going to get any land at all. If you get any, it's going to be up in the mountains right next to the Indians. So by the 1670s, the situation had developed in such a way that the Virginia colony was kind of becoming similar to England 100 years earlier, when there had been that population shift that had led to the English crown financing these ventures to get more colonies to send those landless, unemployed, poor white people to. Well, they sent them there, and they ended their work contract, and now they are landless, unemployed, and disaffected, and there are more of them every year as more and more of those indentured servants reach the end of their contract. So you've got this whole class of unemployed, landless, poor people who are kind of ticked off because the whole promise had been they are going to be able to get land. Well, what was stopping them? The availability of land. Now, there were still several tribes that were in existence in the area. Some had been pushed farther to the west. Some had been decimated by wars and disease, but there were still quite a few left. The royal colony, the royal government of the colony, did not want to be in perpetual warfare with the local Indians. The local Indians that were left were the ones that had sided with the English, that had been their allies, and that they hoped would still be their allies if there were problems with the French or the Spanish. Also, they were the tribes with whom the authorities, the colonial authorities, wanted to be able to trade. Therefore, it was not in the best interests of the colony or of the crown to kill all the Indians. However, those unemployed poor people started agitating for that to be done. All the Indians, no matter whose side they had been on, no matter whether they were good trade partners or not, more and more of this this class, this working class that were largely out of work, wanted those Indians removed from that land to make more land available for them and people like them, which again is the reason that they came over. That's the promise that had been made to them. They weren't getting anywhere with those demands because the Parliament, the Crown, even the royal authorities of the colony had a big picture view, right? There was, by this point, late 1600s, a lot of possessions that England had around the world, and it all had to be kind of kept in balance. Resources had to be allocated appropriately, and they just didn't want to always be at war with the Indians. And in the middle of all this, a very charismatic individual came along named Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon was not an indentured servant, nor was he working class. He was actually from a very well-to-do family in England, and he wound up moving to the Virginia colony in part because he had gotten into so many troubles back in England. His family had sent him to the colonies, and he had the opinion that because he was from such a prominent family that he was going to get to Virginia and immediately given a job at the top of the government, which didn't happen. Now, part of the reason that didn't happen was, as charismatic as he could be with crowds, on an individual one-on-one level, he was kind of an a-hole and nobody liked him much. He was very arrogant and very presumptuous. The governor of the colony really couldn't stand him, wasn't going to be giving him any plum assignments or jobs. And with this going on, Bacon sort of joined in with the poor people there along the frontier who felt like they had been basically cheated. They hadn't been given what they had been promised, an opportunity to advance. Well, even though he's rich, he felt the same way, right? He thought he was coming here, he was going to get this opportunity, and these advancements hadn't come through the way he wanted. So he identified with those former indentured servants and became their spokesperson as they were carrying these arguments to the royal governor. Dear sir, kill these Indians because we want their land. And things just kept getting more and more tense. At one point, in a letter to the royal governor, Bacon wrote to the governor, "You care more about, quote, your dear and protected Indians, end quote, than about your own people." And eventually, 1676, this erupted into a full-scale, all-out rebellion, an uprising of colonists against the colonial government. And by colonists, I mean primarily those poor colonists, led by, again, Bacon, who was not a poor colonist. The former indentured servants were joined in this rebellion by a lot of free black colonists. Now, how did you wind up with free black colonists? They had started importing slaves into the Virginia colony in 1619, and in the early years, the English, who had had no previous experience with the slave trade, treated those slaves kind of like indentured servants, and after so many years would set them free. And this had been happening, and so there had also been this growing class of free blacks in Virginia. So they also were farmers. They also wanted their own land. So they joined in with the poor white guys, the poor black guys, poor white guys. Also a lot of slaves still in slavery, ran away from the owners of the tobacco plantations where they worked, and they joined this rebel army. So, in essence, what you wind up with is in many ways just kind of like the ultimate American story. Class warfare that involves a bunch of poor white people and a bunch of poor black people joining together to stick it to the man, but mainly because they want to kill Indians and take their land. Of course, the colonial government did not accede to this, and it led to actual warfare, which dragged on for a while, and the rebels, led by Bacon, did perhaps better than you would expect. At one point, they seized the capital of Jamestown and burned it to the ground. And the royal governor managed to make his way to a ship and escape, but he was floating on his ship in the harbor, watching his capital city burn. Eventually, the revolution kind of petered out when they lost their leadership, and that happened when Nathaniel Bacon contracted what was called at the time the bloody flux, or dysentery, bloody diarrhea. And oddly enough, he got it in the swamps, leading a bunch of rebels to try to find some Indians to kill. The Indians had very wisely, when all this started happening, withdrawn into the swamps, which they knew really well. So Bacon and his men are just like sloshing around after they burned down Jamestown, trying to find some more Indians to kill. And he contracted a fever and died of bloody diarrhea. So I like to say that Nathaniel Bacon was unable to survive his own movement in more ways than one. So the fighting still continued a little bit after that. In fact, the last 100 or so rebels that were finally decisively defeated, ending the whole thing, more than half of them were of African descent. So in some ways, it is this early cooperation of working class people in colonial America, poor whites and poor blacks working together, trying to overthrow the status quo. But then again, you have to factor in they were wanting to kill Indians and take their land. So all this led to a couple of things, really. Now, I want to stop for a moment and point out that Bacon's Rebellion, which is something that you may have heard of before, the average person on the street, you might go through several average persons on the street till you found anyone who had even heard of Bacon's Rebellion. And when you did, you might go through several more average persons before you found someone who knew anything about it. It maybe got mentioned in your middle school textbook for half a paragraph. But the reality is, and this is my opinion as a historian, but it's the opinion of most American historians, Bacon's Rebellion was one of the most important events in American history. In fact, I would put it in the top 5 most important events in American history because of its impact, because of the repercussions of what happened. And those repercussions were almost immediate. Now, again, you had this situation where poor white farmers and poor free black farmers, as well as slaves, worked together. They cooperated together to overthrow the powers that be. And they almost succeeded. Even if they had succeeded, the whole British Army would have shown up. But still, they came pretty close. They disrupted things quite a bit. And the powers that be didn't like that. That's bad. That's bad for the economy. That's bad for particularly the economy where it concerns the plantation owners, the elites, the financial elites and the political elites, who tended to be the same people. They didn't want that sort of thing happening anymore, and they immediately started taking steps to prevent it from happening in the future. And those steps included passing increasingly harsher laws about slavery, including, now already before this, but not too long before this, the courts in Virginia had concluded that slavery is permanent and it doesn't end after a certain amount of time. But other laws were passed making slavery hereditary, so that the children of a female slave were born as slaves. Also, really strict laws about the behavior of slaves, what would be allowed and what would not be, and the behavior of free blacks, who before this had had no restrictions on their behavior. If they were not a slave and they were black, they essentially had the same rights as anybody else. That is coming to an end in the 1670s with these laws. Also, laws that banned interracial marriage. All efforts to drive a wedge between the poor white workers and the poor black workers, to keep them from ever coming together again in the way they had done on that occasion. So the reason that I say, and so many people say, that this was extremely important, this was the birth of race, really, in America. It was the sort of the forebear of segregation and all the other racial laws designed to sow discord among the laboring classes. And Native Americans were going to be involved in this as well. Efforts were made to keep them from cooperating with slaves, escaped slaves, free blacks, and so forth. So bear that in mind. Anytime you think about race relations in America, this was really, well, the real starting point was 1619 with the arrival of those first slaves. But 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, that was a huge moment. And it was also a huge moment in the development of, the further development of the idea of westward expansion. Because what was this all about? It was all about the fact that those colonists wanted to kill more Indians because the Indians had the land and they wanted the land. And so they are pushing their government to basically sanction those actions so they can continue expanding westward. So, like I said, I mean, this is kind of like the ultimate American story. And that's going to become more obvious as time goes on.